Okay, good. Good afternoon to all. Wir wollen unsere Sitzung.
Let's get started with our meeting. Thanks very much. All the important people are here, so we can get started reasonably punctually. A warm welcome to all of you. Now, a few points to sort out first off. Tomorrow we've got an exchange of views with 4 finance ministers, Germany, Ireland, Italy and the Netherlands. The French minister had to cancel at the last minute because he's got a meeting with the president prior to the 14th of July, the national holiday, at least so he said. It would seem that parliamentary consultations that take place after the recess, first of all, they've got to organise things at a governmental level. So I suppose I understand we've got the German minister, the new Irish minister, the Italian minister and the Dutch minister. 3 of these ministers are old hands. The Irish minister is rather newer. And I think in the light of experience in the tax committee, which a lot of you were on, we will proceed in much the same way. Questions about implementing what we're calling for, new steps towards international agreements, and also the question of national responsibility. Question and answer, yes. Everybody gets 5 minutes to give their position, and we'll have question and answer rounds with the possibility to ask short answers and questions. Let's see how it pans out. In the interim, since the hearing of Mrs. Jourova, the vice chair took that in hand because we had to switch things again. I had to go to Germany. And then there's a trip to Portugal. And of course, last weekend there was the trip to Cyprus. The report has been drawn up. These were very different trips. All political groups had more questions to answer, really. In Cyprus, it's more a banking crisis, and there was a troika, and I think without the public pressure, they wouldn't have addressed things as quickly. That's our impression, but of course, there's still plenty of questions that are still open. Then there's the question of the extension of our mandate. We obtained that until September. That's the last one we can get, so we will have had a year and a half all told. And by November or December at the very latest, we have to submit our final report or recommendations to plenary. Those are the main points I had to convey to you. Today, we'll be discussing the drafts and recommendations. First of all, my thanks to the Secretariat and the 2 rapporteurs, Jeppe Kofod and Peter Jacek. The translations are at least in part there, so I think everybody should be able to cope with the text and read them in their own language. I don't want to make too much of an introductory set of remarks. We all know a lot of work's gone into this. I'm sure the groups will have plenty to add. There's a question of the documentation. Some of these were only submitted last week, and that's a little bit problematic. I think we need to consider the fact-finding missions as well. And I also think that in this committee, despite our limited scope, we do need to look at certain individual cases. Willingness to cooperate available to people, refusal to make documentation available and so forth. I don't want to pass judgment at this stage, but I would prefer to give the floor to the rapporteurs. Who'd like to start first? Have you worked it out yet? Jeppe Kofod will start. 10 minutes. and then the shadow.
Bitte schön, Jeppe, als erstes für die...
Jeppe, if you'd care to present your report.
Thank you so much, Chair, and also for the comments. I agree very much with you that we have the framework of the inquiry committee we have, so we have to work under these conditions, also with regard access to documents, which we've been discussing a lot. So, but thank you so much, all of you, for attending. And I would like actually to start by thanking the panel secretariat for their professionalism and their invaluable contribution to the work that we have as co-rapporteurs in this committee. I would also like to thank the political groups for your written input during the process. It's also been very important. And then on the inquiry committee format is still in active development, but I'm glad to see that the work has been approached with interest, with active participation, and also with a high degree of professionalism. Dear colleagues, before I go into details of the draft report, allow me briefly to go through the requirements we are working under. As this is an inquiry committee, we are called upon to state facts and figures in our findings. Findings are evidence-based, linked to the work of the committee, and should therefore, as a rule of thumb, I think, be shared by the committee as a whole. Our findings reports must be built on this framework. So now a few words on the format and the process going forward. As you know, the format is a report in 3 parts with a limited amount of space. The first part contained the committee's findings, as mentioned. The second part is our recommendations. And finally, the third part is an annex describing all of the incredible amount of work, the committee's activities, hearings, missions, and so on, and it's also a very important part of our documentation for what we have done. Mr. Jessica and I will seek an open and inclusive amendment process. The timeline for the work in the committee is very compressed, as you know. As this timeline was set out by the Parliament, we do not have much room to postpone or prolong anymore. We have extended that. This is quite simply the conditions we're working under, and we have to work. Therefore, I urge you kindly to be flexible and compromise-oriented as possible, and we look forward to hear your inputs and suggestions, and we will carefully take note of all groups' contributions in the process. Both co-rapporteurs look forward to working with you after the deadline for the amendment has passed, and we prepare amendments and compromise amendments. As we do that, we should all keep in mind that broad majorities will send the strongest message, both to the citizens, to the Commission, to the Member States, and therefore, on that basis, let me go into the content of the report. The fact-finding are grouped under the following topics. First, tax evasion and tax avoidance, including offshore structures, and also a common EU list of non-cooperative tax jurisdictions. We conclude that offshore structures are instrumental in illegal tax schemes and that they are largely merely shell companies and opaque form of structures. 2, money laundering, including anti-money laundering legislation, an EU anti-money laundering list of high-risk third countries, on finance intelligence units. Here we have found a critical lack of cooperation and coordination between Member State authorities, also in many of our missions, in our studies and so on, and between national enforcement bodies on the fight against tax evasion, tax avoidance and money laundering. This is a crucial finding which will be picked up in the recommendation, as you all have seen. Third, intermediaries. This is a very central part of the findings. The EU and Member States have failed miserably to regulate intermediaries. We look closely on the legal framework, on the roles and responsibilities of intermediaries, the banks, the lawyers, the accountants firms, the auditors, the trusts, the wealth managers, and so on. And the intermediaries, they have a key role in setting up shell companies. As such, we find a need for, I would say, criminal responsibility and sanctions as intermediaries take advantage of incomplete legislative framework when it comes to tax and money laundering. Fourth, third country dimension, including developing countries. We categorically conclude that these illicit practices disproportionately affect developing countries. We have seen it in our hearings. It's an important statement, and therefore we need to act together with them. On whistleblowers, the lack of protection of whistleblowers is of course not a new finding, but we underscore it once again to highlight the urgent need for action in this field. 6, institutional cooperation. Here we have seen a breach of sincere cooperation principle in the lack of cooperation of the Council with the PANA Committee. Chairman alluded to it in his comments. This is also a crucial finding. Member States and Council must step up their efforts on illicit tax schemes. Finally, we conclude on the basis of the chapters that the PANA Committee's findings, several cases of maladministration of EU legislation can be identified, namely regarding the Directive of Administrative Cooperation, the MLD, and the list of third countries with strategic deficiencies in their anti-money laundering regimes and so on. So these things we clearly see that, maladministration have taken place. So if I go to the recommendations of the report briefly, based on our findings, the recommendation report put forward solutions and expectations. I'm happy to say we already have included and incorporated many of the contributions from the shadows in the process. I will emphasize several important recommendations. We call on the Commission and Member States to step up their efforts, commitments, and allocate resources to improve supervision and enforcement to ensure that wrongdoers are held accountable. We call for EU FATCA and international reciprocity. It's a very important principle. Furthermore, we call for a EU FIU, a truly FIU on EU level to be set up. We need to give our authorities the best tools, but transparency and knowledge is the foundation of good and efficient administration. We need a clear definition and quantification statistics on tax haven, tax evasion and tax avoidance. We need ambitious criteria for an EU list of tax havens with strong sanctions such as the suspension of third countries' equivalent regime. We call for a ban of harmful tax amnesties. We reiterate, based on our findings, our new findings, the Tax 2 report called for a creation of a new Union Tax Policy Coherence and Coordination Centre. We see it definitely on the EU level. We need to strengthen the institutional capacity to deal with this phenomenon. We need to shift from self-regulation to appropriate supervision and state-controlled regulation for currently self-regulated professions. We need stronger sanctions at both EU and member state level against banks and intermediaries. We need to fight tax evasion and money laundering on a global level. We need to call for a global summit on ending secrecy and also a stronger UN tax body to deal with the global dimension as well. Finally, we need EU legislation for the protection of whistleblowers. And I have to go, it goes both for the public and private sector, all types of whistleblowers. So in conclusion, I believe we have a strong draft in front of us, which can be strengthened even further, of course, with your amendments, and it's important to cooperate in that regard. I urge you all to seek broad majorities and workable compromises, so our findings and recommendations carry as much weight as possible when we adopt them. So I think with this very brief remarks, I look very much forward to a constructive cooperation and to hear your views on our report and findings and recommendations so far. So thank you so much for your attention.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Kofod.
Thanks, Mr. Kofod, for that overview and for expressing this active desire to find as broad a possible majority. That's very important if we want to exercise any pressure at all. Mr. Jacek now, please.
Thank you, Chair. Well, to complement what Jeppe said and to stress some elements, well, one of the main conclusions I draw from this work is that the practices revealed in the Panama Papers would not have happened, at least not have happened to such extent, if the national governments and the Commission had taken their responsibility and more proactively acted to improve, implement and enforce EU legislation. For us, there there was some evidence of maladministration, which is also written, of course, in the report. I would mention paragraph 57 and 58, which relate to the implementation of the Anti-Money Laundering Directive 3. Although infringement procedures were sent to several member states, there were still shortcomings in their implementation of that directive. It also questions the effectiveness of the infringement procedure to verify the quality of implementation by member states. By not responding adequately to these shortcomings, member states have allegedly failed to enforce AMLD 3 effectively. It also points to the fact that the Commission has potentially failed to enforce these provisions by ensuring proper implementation. Paragraph 95 observes that Member States' authorities failed to effectively supervise financial institutions even before the Panama Papers revelations, and that they did not adequately sanction the financial institutions that were found liable for serious breach of the national provisions adopted pursuant to AMLD 3. Para 135 concludes that the lack of cooperation from the Council and the Commission, at least the obstacles they created to our access to documents, can be considered as a breach of the sincere cooperation principle. This lack of cooperation obstructed our work heavily. Even more importantly, and perhaps even more worrying, is that the mere fact that the Commission does not put enough resources to fulfil its obligation for the supervision and implementation of the AMLD legislation, as we see with the delegated act on high-risk third countries. It constitutes maladministration. At least it seems that the Commission has taken this seriously and it's preparing itself for the future work. In terms of recommendations, I'm glad that we easily agreed on common political recommendations with Jeppe, and these, I would reiterate, focus mainly on more transparency, how to better regulate intermediaries, more transparency on the beneficial owners. The report regrets still that the European Council is blocking the beneficial ownership for trusts. Well, we advocate stronger sanctions regime towards intermediaries who facilitate tax evasion and money laundering or money laundering. Well, better exchange of information is certainly needed between tax administration, but also between FIUs. More resources are needed for tax administration, Commission, but perhaps most importantly for FIUs. Well, on whistleblowers, it's been already said that there is a need for EU-wide legislation on their protection. On the interinstitutional cooperation and rights of inquiry committee, I think that the inquiry committee approach, or how it's outlined at the moment, it needs substantial change if it is to be more effective in the future, and the Parliament should give some thoughts to it. We have a very good example in US Congress. And on the recommendations, I would add that some of them can be solved even directly under current revision of the AMLD. Some of us are taking place in the trilogue. However, we see again that member states, at least some of them, are blocking major reforms towards transparency. I hope we will have a solid agreement between political groups on this report, and I think this can only reinforce our mandate for AMLD revision negotiation with the Council, and in general to the broad support would put all the other recommendations better in practice. Well, lastly, I can assure you this is the best draft report the PANA committee has ever produced, and I would seek your support for it. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thanks very much. Thanks to both of our rapporteurs for presenting their reports. Can I just emphasize that here in the committee, we can adopt or submit amendments to both parts of the report. For the plenary, it's only the recommendations. Members can submit amendments to all parts of the report. Subsequently, when it goes to plenary, it's only amendments to the recommendations. Now, the first shadow colleague is Mr. Niedermayer from the EPP. Ludek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So first of all, let me say that it was long and hard work on a very important subject, the subject that is part of our ongoing effort to improve the tax agenda within the European Union. Let me start about INI report that I believe provides a substantive overview of issues uncovered in the Panama Papers, as well as legislation that was passed over the last few years that helps closing some loopholes. And also, INI reports includes findings of many meetings and missions that took place within the PANA committee. The amount of information and material available to the committee was really massive, and I believe that rapporteurs managed quite well to put the findings and facts into the INI report. I very much appreciate the effort to address our request that was included after the shadow meeting just before the report was published. I believe that still some elements can be better sorted out or clarified. Particularly, this is the issue of time. As we know, Panama Papers covers a very long set of the data going back to the 70s, and we must take into the account that time issue. Time frame for findings and breaches of legislation must be clear, and the evidence supporting these findings should come from the same period of time. Old cases may not be so relevant if they were addressed by legislation that is already addressed. And we also cannot prove breaches of the law of today with cases of yesterday. I believe that sorting out the time issue would be very helpful for finding really well-justified conclusions in the following part. Obviously, as also in the case of recommendation, we will look at the report carefully and come with our amendments, but given the complication, given the amount of information, work was done really very well in any report. Concerning the recommendations we have got just last week, I would say that they are key. They have a key importance in the framework of our work, as we have seen in Tax 1 and Tax 2 recommendations. If our recommendations are well justified, many of them serve to push for the Commission to come with the proposals and legislative action. And this is actually a goal of our work, so we must pay very important attention to that. I am pleased to see that co-rapporteurs provided us with the draft recommendations that are well linked to any report, and the structure of the report is logical, and we can find the evidence on which recommendations stand. I appreciate and agree with many recommendations in the report, for example, as need to pay attention to issue of wealth managers, as well as emphasis of proper implementation of existing law and legislation by member states. And also, let me repeat how important it is to push forward ALM 5 regulation that is now actually in trilogue, and I believe that members of parliament should help to find the compromise with the Council, because AML5 can close many loopholes that we have seen during our work. On the other hand, I guess it's important that we respect fully the mandate of PANA committee, not to exceed it. And also it's, I guess, not important to address the issues that were covered by different reports and do not have direct link to PANA committee. I guess respecting the mandate and providing well-justified recommendation is the key component to reach that the other two important bodies, Commission and the Council, will take our recommendation seriously and will take necessary action. Obviously, I can find in recommendations some points that I don't agree or I would like to have more debate, and we will probably address them in our amendments. For example, I am not sure if it's so easy to set up in legislation what is immoral. I would like to see more details about what is consideration of rapporteurs concerning introduction of EU FATCA, and also I am not sure if just ban on outsourcing of due diligence is the way how to make sure that due diligence will be of high quality and will prohibit the things that we don't want to see. But I'm quite happy to debate all these things. I don't share always the view that we should put as many things into legislation, because I still believe that self-regulation and setting up standard is a very effective way how to actually include into regulatory framework things that are not all law-based, but this is the future of discussions and finding the right balance of report. Again, as I said, we will provide some amendment, but even now let me just appreciate very hard work of all the committee, especially Chair and Secretariat, and